Hey everybody, thanks very much for joining me here today. We're going to be talking about how we handle prepay costs and benefits at Intuit, and this is something we've had pretty well handled for a number of years now, but I still see in the FinOps community a lot of organizations struggling with this and impacting the amount of savings they're able to realize with things like RAs and savings plans because of it. And so hopefully out of this I can help you get on top of that if that's something you're still maybe struggling with just a little bit. And it'll be kind of AWS focused, but most of these things are really would be applicable to any of the major clouds. So yeah, just agenda there real quick. We'll just do intro, savings plans, RA review, talk a little bit about accounting's view on things. Accounting, we talk a lot about like technology and finance, but not always accounting so much, and so they've got an important perspective on things. And then sort of at the end here, the problems that we face and the process that we follow into it to get through it. And this is going to go probably a lot faster than a lot of the other things you've seen today, so if you're trying to take pictures of every slide, good luck. And really, like, this is something I've probably done this talk maybe 10 or 12 times, not publicly, but this is part of the sort of orientation I give every new person that joins my team. So if you're a FinOps analyst or a data engineer or something that just joined the Intuit FinOps team, this is one of the subjects that we sort of cover in orientation. So we'll get into it here. So. For those of you that don't know much about Intuit, we've been at this quite a long time, and I was just talking with LV Lee, my finance partner here. We got to start back in 2015, right after reInvent. We'd bought some RIs and wanted to see how much we were saving, and it's given us a lot of time to get up to run speed. And I'd like to think we've been running for at least 4 or 5 years now, and the finish line still isn't in sight. Maybe it's there somewhere. And in that time, we've designed and built a lot of really great stuff, what we're talking about here today with savings plans and the benefit, but also doing allocations of shared costs, managing your waste, doing forecasting, all those sorts of things. And one of Intuit's current sort of slogan is powering prosperity around the world. And so hopefully with this we can help power the prosperity of you and your organization. Intuit only buys 3 or all up front on things, so that means we have a lot to amortize. But what I'd say is before you just follow that is to do the math for yourself to see if that's what makes sense for you based on whether you're borrowing money, if you've got a big treasure vault of cash to pull from, the sort of interest rates that you're dealing with will influence the decision you make. And actually, even for us, from the time I wrote this until today, we're actually modifying our posture a little bit on this. So just always stay up to date on what your company's sort of cost of cash is, things like that, so you're making the right decisions when it comes to buying partial, no, or all upfront RIs and savings plans. But we spend a lot of money on them. And really, when you look at our net costs, about a third of our net costs every month is just amortization of all the investments that we've made before. So it's really, really important that large body of expense gets handled just the way we want it to be. We can't be loosey-goosey. We can't have stuff go missing. So it's a really big and important part of our overall sort of cost picture. And one thing, too, that's maybe a little bit different, a lot of times these talks sort of have an infomercial kind of format where does this happen to you, where everything's on fire and you got to go put... with us, we've been pretty lucky in that we've been able to sort of see problems coming and get them solved before they sort of caught fire. And so that's, maybe from a sort of career point of view, that's maybe a sort of dubious strategy a little bit, in that it's hard for your leaders to maybe appreciate and understand what you're doing if they haven't sort of felt that visceral heat of the conflagration. So it's up to you whether or not you want to try to stay ahead of stuff like we have, or maybe just let things burn a little bit so they understand why you're there. But that's the subject of a whole nother talk. So for us, these are our principles that we have in how we handle our prepaid benefits. These aren't necessarily the right ones. These are just the ones that work for us. And so for you, wherever you are, it's not so much that you need to do what Intuit's doing, but you do need to figure out what makes sense for your organization. Get those written down, get them really clear so that everybody who's operating and dealing with these things is all sort of on the same page about what's important. And so for us, that's everybody should be paying the same rate for the same thing. Everybody should be getting a sort of a fair share of the savings benefit. The rates should be kept as stable as possible through, we have a lot of seasonal fluctuations as people file their taxes and things like that. So we've got to dampen things as best we can so that when it comes to forecasting and modeling, people have as predictable sort of a future as we can build for them. For us, we can't be a profit or loss center. I know that I've seen some really cool stuff. Josh Bauman, formerly of EA, formerly of Aptio, now of IBM, they build some cool stuff where they lock in their rates and everybody pays the same rate for the whole year. And then there's, unless they're perfect, there's some under and overage that deal with. That's really cool. For us, we couldn't be a profit or loss center, which means that we have to pass the exact net cost of our instances back to all of our dev teams all the time so that everything zeroes out at the end. And again, for us, that's where we are, but that might not be right for you. And of course, accounting has very sort of strict and precise expectations around how this all gets handled that we need to adhere to. And of course, all these things we want to make happen, none of them happen out of the box. These are all things that we have to sort of twist and force our billing data to do for our company. None of this just happens. So we'll just do a real quick sort of RI savings plan review. This is a 300 level thing, so most of you should be sort of familiar with these by now. This will just be sort of a graphic convention that, if there's an empty cup, that means you had some usage that you could have covered, but you didn't buy anything. And then all the way down at the bottom, if you bought too much, you've got waste and you're overflowing. So RIs are a pain. If you've been dealing with this for a while, you've got potentially dozens or hundreds of different targets where you've got to be, applying just the right amount of investment for just the right amount of time against a precise target. People, workloads are growing and shrinking. It's just really hard to stay on top of all that. There are various third parties and things that can help with it, but overall, it just requires constant upkeep, constant modification, and reinvestment of things to stay on top of and manage RIs really well. So we prefer savings plans, and it's much easier because it collapses what were dozens or hundreds of targets in an RI landscape down to essentially a single target. And that single target expands and contracts at the macro level much less than all those individual targets do. And as a result, you're able to manage to a much higher level of coverage and savings than you could against all these little targets. So we love savings plans. We want to use them as much as we can to provide coverage to everything that can be covered by them. And again, like their behavior in contrast with RIs, where you've got to be right on the money with all your different targets. With savings plans, their behavior is to cover the highest sub-coverage stuff first, where you save the most money. And the more you pour in there, it just trickles down to progressively lower and lower savings things. And these rates, I showed somebody this and I said, those rates are really high. Well, that's the 3-year all upfront rate. So if you're buying 1 year, no upfronts, your percentages will be quite a bit lower, but there's lots of stuff that saves 60, 70%, if you're buying 3-year all upfront. So we like savings plans. Into the accounting requirements now. So this is just sort of Intuit's view on things. Your accounting group that you work with may have a different perspective on things. But again, it's very important that you get these sort of requirements or expectations established so that as you're going about addressing how to handle the amortization of your prepay and how to handle your savings benefit, that it's meeting the sort of needs of your technology organization, but also your accounting organization. And there may be SOX requirements, there'll be other things that come into play. So one of our first sort of tenets here is back to that everybody pays the same rate for the same thing, is that we have to provide equal treatment to all of our different lines of business. So Intuit has TurboTax, what we call our consumer group, the small business group with QuickBooks, things like that. And when we report our earnings to the street, we actually report each line of business individually, right? And this isn't anything insider, of course, this is just public 10K stuff, but you can see, each of the different segments we report. And so it's important, like it's really mandatory for us that we're about a $14-15 billion company these days. Almost all of that revenue is generated by, SaaS products running in the cloud. And so if we were to not provide equal treatment to our different lines of business, that could result in us misstating the profitability of one of those lines of business, right? That's a big no-no. So it's very important to accounting that everybody's getting a fair shake. Otherwise, we could be, whether purposely or inadvertently, inflating or reducing the apparent profitability of one of our lines of business. So it matters a lot. The next thing here is you might hear the term waterfall, and maybe the accounting folks don't get out much. That doesn't look like a waterfall to me, but that's what they call it. But this is the way they look at the amortization of the investments that you've bought. So, and we'll go into more detail on this in a little bit, but it's important that, their view of how the costs, when you go, whether it's partial or all upfront investment that you're making, that the amortization of that investment is realized on the schedule that fits their model and fits everything else that they have going on. So we'll talk more about the waterfall, but that's another important thing. We do what we call a straight line amortization. At AWS, everything is either 12 or 36 months. Again, for us, everything's 36 months. But this is sort of how, if you were to buy a $120,000, say, savings plan that had a 12-month lifespan, a straight line amortization would have a $10,000 a month sort of clip, right? So after 12 months, you've amortized that full $120,000. But of course, not all months are the same length. And this is one of those areas where our sort of current state of compromise is that accounting gets everything they want, but in maybe a world where the development community got everything they want, we probably wouldn't do a straight line amortization because February is about 10% shorter than January, right? So the straight line amortization means that we have to sort of on a per hour basis see a much higher amortization amount happening in February than we see in January. So we try to counteract that by providing guidance to everybody that says, hey, by the way, in February, your instances are going to cost, maybe 5 to 10% more than they cost in January. So they can bake that into their forecasts, but there's maybe other ways of doing it. But this is just sort of where we are right now. And then, as you start to stack successive purchases, the amount that you need to amortize in a given month is essentially the vertical sum, across those months. So you can see, like for month 3, as we go into month 3, we've made 2 prior purchases that are each amortizing at $10,000 a month. So the total amortization we need to realize in that 3rd month is $20,000 out of this waterfall. But as you can see, as you maybe start to get out to 36 months, this would be quite a bit bigger. Another thing is what we call the 1st and 15th rule. So this is something that we've iterated on a few times over the years, which is, hey, we just bought some stuff. When should the amortization of this purchase begin? Should it start like in the minute that we made the purchase? Should it start next month? Should it start on the 1st of this month? And the sort of compromise position we've established is that for purchases made up through the 15th, we'll begin the amortization on the 1st. But for anything made the 16th or later, we'll start it next month. So again, there's pros and cons to that, and there's the whole thing with February that makes it hard. But again, just something to be clear on, right? So that there should be no ambiguity between what you're building, your accounting group, the tech group who sees the rates, how things are going to behave. And of course, precision. Close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. There's no room for missing dollars in account. Hey, where'd that 100,000 go? So everything you do has to be very precise. That may mean having to carry many decimal points of accuracy in your numbers and things as you start to shard things out, but everything's got to be right on. Okay, so these are those things in bold. There are a couple of our principles we talked about earlier, which is everybody should pay the same rate for the same thing, and everybody should receive sort of a fair share of the savings benefit. These investments that we're making that save us money on running our fleet, it shouldn't just be the lucky few or even the lucky majority that get that benefit. It really ought to be equitably distributed out to everybody who's running in your cloud and done in a fair way. The problem is, with savings plans, we're sort of a split mind here in that we like that they go to the instances and the usage that saves us the most first. That's good. We don't want our cloud, we don't want AWS or anybody else to change that behavior because that's what ultimately saves us the most money. But the problem is that if you're a group who uses things that maybe save on the low end, you may never see, or you may only rarely see any coverage from savings plans. If you have 100% coverage all the time, then that's great, but that's hard to achieve. So we need to find a better way of ensuring that everybody's getting some benefit, not just the teams that are using, the stuff that saves 50, 60, 70%. And then, of course, with RIs, as you may know, this has been a problem forever, is it's sort of a lottery. Again, unless you have 100% coverage, only certain instances are going to get covered. You can't really control where that is. or if you do control it, you end up sort of limiting how much you can buy. So it's not fair for some of the teams some of the time, and you can't really count on the random application of RIs providing for an equitable distribution of the benefit to different teams over time. Another thing in particular with savings plans, when your level of usage is consistent, everybody sees consistent rates. But as things happen in your fleet, and the example here is if you have a large expansion in usage at something that saves sort of one of the higher amounts, say maybe there's a big load test or there's some big event that happens over a weekend or something where there's a large expansion in usage up at something that saves 50 or 60%, what that's going to do is that's going to sort of absorb your savings plan investment and leave those buckets that have slightly lower savings amount, say down at like the 40 or 30% level, it'll sort of leave them dry and uncovered. And so what that can mean for, like an example here is something that saves 45%, if on Friday it was fully covered, and then on Saturday it's not covered at all, that results in an 81% increase in the effective cost to that team that was using that workload, even though they didn't change anything, right? So that's way too dramatic of a swing in costs that we'd want to provide to teams. So we need to find a way to dampen those fluctuations so that as parts of our fleet expand and contract, it leaves a more sort of stable rate for everybody, again, but while still being sort of net zero. So the solution here, and this is again, just what we've chosen to do. This isn't necessarily like the way. What's best for your organization may be different, but the sort of paradigm here, if you will, is on the left is what things look like if you don't do anything. So the sort of blue is the usage that is receiving coverage from your savings plans. And so again, unless you're 100% covered, there's the things that have the lower percentage savings amount just aren't going to get covered, right? And so instead what we do is I think of it as like a vessel full of water. We turn it on its side so that everybody is receiving the same sort of fractional realization of the potential savings, for their usage. So even if you're using stuff that saves 12%, you're still going to see and say maybe 80% of the total possible savings for your fleet was realized. The group that's using 12% will still see 80% of that 12% realized, right? Not just versus the teams that save 60% seeing 100% and then you seeing 0. So this is sort of the visual way of thinking about it. But that's sort of the conceptual thing. So this is an 11-step process, so buckle up. So first step is we look at our, from accounting, we basically get input of, hey, for this month, this is what we need to amortize. And that can change if we make any purchases up through the 15th. But we have to start, we have a placeholder value so that we don't want any big like jumps in the amortization target changing throughout the month. So we start with the placeholder value. The next thing we do is we turn that into an hourly thing. So everything we do is the sort of brick level is the hour. And after we've added all the hours up across the month, we have the whole month's numbers. But everything is sort of recalculated hour by hour by hour. So at Intuit, our rates actually have micro fluctuations every hour so that every hour, again, is netting out to 0. But again, you can see here, this is where February is 10% more than January with the same sort of target. So maybe you guys can solve that better than we have. The next step for us is, you've made investments in savings plans, RIs, across a multitude of services. These are just some Amazon examples. These aren't this isn't our exact distribution. But this could be, what it looks like for you, right? A lot in EC2, a bunch of RDS, and various other services sort of make up your fleet. So you should have a good inventory of all the investments that you've made across all these different services. And so you should be able to understand, the various value that you've made and thus the sort of relative value of your savings plans against your RIs, so that you can say, okay, for when this amortization is occurring, this is how it needs to be distributed into each of these different services. So that's step 3. Sort of step 3B here is with Lambda and Fargate and how EC2 compute savings plans can cover Lambda and Fargate usage. This is a little trickier because you can't just look at your sort of savings plan inventory to ascertain this. You have to actually go look at the usage Lambda and Fargate, I think, usually save around 18%. So if you had enough savings plan, some of it might have gone into this, so you need to look at how much went into there too. So we take the split, and back from step 2, we figured out sort of our amortization target for the hour, and we basically apply that distribution of our investment against that hourly target. So we can see now for each of the different services in use, how much we need to be amortizing within that service for that hour. So that's that hour's amortization target. Next step here is we need to get to a total cost. So if we're lucky and perfect, everything was 100% covered. That's not generally the case. There's usually some on-demand cost. In this step, you're only looking at the types of usage that were potentially covered by the RIs or savings plan. So things like network and storage that aren't applicable, those are out of scope. But any instances that were used or other types of usage that could have been covered are in scope for this. So like in this example we're stepping through here, we had, back from this step, we had a $19.35 amortization target for EC2, but we still had a little bit on demand. So when we look at the sort of prepay addressable body of usage, our total cost for that was $25. A little bit on demand plus our amortization target. And so that's kind of like the total net cost of running the prepay applicable types of usage in that hour. So how do we split that $25 cost out to all the different usages? And again, going back to that sort of turning the vessel on its side, the way that we do it is we look at, well, what's the sort of relative value of all the different things we had going on? Something you may see is that there might be 2 different instance types that each cost $1 retail, but one of them might see a 60% discount with a 3-year all upfront RI or savings plan. The other one might only see 20%. So in a sort of uncovered world, those things have equal value, but in a covered world, this one costs half what this other one costs. So what we use to establish the relative value of all the different things in use is their 3-year all upfront savings plan rate. And so that sort of, again, informs us the relative value of all the different things we had going on. So based on that, step 8, we look at all the different things we had in use. We look at that, we use that 3-year all upfront price, and that tells us sort of the perfect, if we were perfect, this is how much everything would have cost us. And sort of jumping here to step 9, this is the relative value of each of the different types of usage we had in our fleet. So these are actual numbers, or at least recent numbers from AWS, but this is like a hypothetical fleet composition. For you, you probably have dozens or hundreds of different usage types, but this is just obviously super simplified. So again, from these percentages, like in this case, we now know that 25% of our sort of value received was in M6I larges, and 40% in X larges, and another 40% in 2X larges. So obviously that needs to add to 100%, but at this point, we now, within this service, we understand the distribution of the value received into all these different usage types. And that's our guide here for step 10, which is going, if we remember several steps earlier, we figured out that our total net cost for EC2 for that hour was $25. We use that $25 and apply this sort of proportionality that we've established in the last few steps to divide that into each of the different usage types. So again, like M6I large was 20% of the value we received. We know our total net cost was $25. So the total cost of running M6I larges was $5 for that hour. And the last step here then is, because we have a usage quantity, we have the total cost for that line, we can now basically compute our own blended rate. I know like Amazon has a blended rate column. That's not what we use, but this is how we blend our rate here internally, and that's the rate that everybody across Intuit pays. So if you had an RI on your thing, if it was on demand, if you had a savings plan, doesn't matter. You're going to pay this amount. Right, and it's very different from what Cost Explorer tells you or anything else, and so we had to build all our own tools to do all the things that the native cloud things do. But this is the rate that assures that accounting's amortization is realized precisely, that we're net zero, and that everything's going to balance out. So for us, like kind of the last step here is to then, this is kind of like behind the scenes. We do a lot of special curve processing as part of our allocations things. So we'll basically ignore that original billing line that had whatever cost it had from Amazon, and we'll write in our own line that says, no, that usage costs this amount. And there's some other stuff we do to decode the usage type and operations so that we know what we're at the instance. But then when we go to sort of roll things back up again for various reports, again, we'll just sort of ignore that original row, and we'll use this new row that we wrote in its place. So that's it. Questions?
Oh, yeah, we got time for a few more questions from the audience. I see Colleen putting her hand up first, so I'll do a run.
Hi. You've got an hourly rate. What happens when it's daylight saving or extra?
What happens when it, sorry?
Daylight saving, when the time changes.
That's a good question. I don't actually know. I have to look. Nobody's barked about it yet, so it can't be too bad, but.
And then sort of related to that,
Yeah.
do you have instances in different regions where the time differences will change all the time? They'll have, so I know there's a 2-week lag between the UK and the US.
Two-week lag? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Oh, the time changes at different times?
Yeah.
That's another time change question. Yeah, I don't know actually what happens, but hopefully it's not a bad thing, whatever. I mean, yeah. I'm still employed.
No,
Yeah.
I do it, rather than hours, I do it by days in a month, so then it...
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think when we calculate when we go from taking the monthly target and turning that into the month's hourly target,
Yeah.
we take into consideration the number of hours that are going to happen in that month. And so it should be the case that it's being caught there, right? So if we're losing an hour, instead of 700 or however many February normally has, it would be one fewer or one, or no, that's for leap year. Time change is another, yeah, I don't, but it should be handled there, I think. That's
Yeah.
where you'd want to catch it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. One question, probably a follow-up, depending on how you answer it. How often do you purchase 3-year savings plans?
All the time,
So
as often as we can.
would there be more value if you consolidated those and say bought one a quarter or a couple times a year, rather than buy them every month or more frequently?
No,
that
I
you
think
did larger
you want to
deals?
keep your cycle as frequent as you can, so that as things are happening in your fleet, you're basically staying as close to the optimal as it can be. So I think the greater frequency at which you assess what should we buy, what should we trade on the RI side, the closer to optimal you'll be.
One more question. I saw someone putting up his hand. Oops.
I have many questions, but well, I'll try to put as many as I can in this one. So first of all, what is your coverage target that you try to achieve? Second, how do you deal, if at all, with utilization base? So at some point you decide how much you need to buy based on this target coverage, and you decided, so his team is expected to use X amount and his team twice that. In the end of the day, none of them achieved the utilization they expected. Is much less or much more, whatever. But when it's less, how do you deal with that? Okay, you overfill, right? You would be overcommitted because the expectation didn't realize. So
You're talking about like if we overbought on savings plans?
if it happens, right?
Yeah.
So, and that, or savings plans or RIs. So RIs, especially standard, if you do 3 years,
Yeah.
you don't get, you may sell them on the marketplace, but you don't get
Right.
to change them, convert them. So how do you deal with that? Do you have this kind of problems? And the last one is it worthwhile? How much time do you invested together with your team to build all this, not necessarily the process, but all the systems that need to support the process?
Yeah, okay. So the first one was coverage. That's a very loaded term, and that could be a whole other half-hour thing. The way that we've sort of evolved to look at it is that, especially since we lock into 3 years, that over the past 3 years, there exists a perfect behavior that we could have exhibited, right? That would have resulted in the optimal amount of savings. And so how close were we to that, right? And so for everybody's going to have it, like coverage to me is kind of meaningless because the sort of dynamic nature of your fleet, like there's certain workloads that could never, like 80% would be unattainable, where there's others where 100% would be easy. So we just look at how close to perfect did we behave over the last 3 years. This waste and over purchase. So the amortization is going to happen, right, regardless. So if you have bought too much, what that's going to mean is that the amount of dollars that you're amortizing in that hour, in that month, is going to be higher than maybe it should have been. And so that's sort of how, like there's another processes you might have to sort of account for and manage RI waste or savings plan waste differently, but for us it's just baked into that amortization number, so there's nothing extra and special we have to do about it. But we definitely keep track of where we are to try to keep that as low as possible. The last thing, the time to build, we had a lot of this stuff in place at the time we built this, but we really built it, like, I remember it was a very stressful month. It was right after they announced savings plans in November of 2019. We had a window to get our first purchase in before Christmas, and so we worked our butts off for those 4 weeks to revise how we were doing all of our rate blending, specifically to account for the behavior of savings plans. So it was about 4 weeks. We were very busy, so we could get our first big savings plan purchase in time.
All right. Jason, thank you so much.
I can take more questions outside, too.
Round of applause for Jason and this magnificent level 300 credit. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching that session. I'm sitting here in San Diego right after FinOps X. We hope you join us next year here live 2024. In the meantime, please subscribe to the channel and join the community. Get involved, join the summits, get in a working group, and don't forget to get FinOps certified. Because next year here in San Diego for FinOps X, it's going to be twice as big. Come join the party. Come meet your people. Welcome home.